Well, hello, and welcome to Bio 211 at Norwalk Community College. This is Chapter 9, which the topic is joints. More precisely, it's articulations, and how is it if inside Chapter 6 we built a skeletal system. Mother Nature now needs to create a series of mechanisms that are going to allow for motion to occur between all of those 206 bones, not necessarily all at the same time, such that it doesn't become disarticulated. Okay, so we want to figure out how Mother Nature can make immovable joints, slightly movable joints, and freely movable joints. And you'll see why that's important in a few minutes, I hope. Okay? But, essentially Chapter 9 is about, can you understand that there are specific types of joint classifications, and those are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. And you have types of movement at synovial joints. In fact, I would go so far as to say that inside this chapter, what you're studying most is how Mother Nature allows for motion at synovial joints. The rest of it is all just definitional and description. What are those different types of synovial joints, and then what's going to cause range of motion, okay? And we're going to introduce a couple of different joints in the body, but I want you paying most attention to, say, the knee joint, okay? Obviously, as we age, our joints are going to begin to fail. I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about that at all, though, okay? So let's just dive right into it. So a moment ago, I said that joints are classified, right? And fibrous joints are held together by dense collagen fibers, usually sheets of collagen. Bold, underline, italicize, okay? Cartilaginous joints are held together by cartilage, and synovial joints are held together by ligaments. And it's the first time we've used the word ligament since when? I don't remember when, because we didn't use it inside Chapter 6, but ligaments are strands of dense connective tissue that are holding joints that might have different angles applied to them. And it's from bone to bone. So the way to think of a ligament is connective tissue to connective tissue, not as a tendon. Tendon would be muscle to bone. Okay? That makes sense. Now, a moment ago I said that there are functional classifications in there. Immovable, slightly movable, and freely movable joints. So if we're going to build it, this is the structural classification: fibrous joint, cartilaginous joint, and synovial joint. Functional classification is that joint moving? Okay, so if it's freely movable, we would call it diarthrotic. If it's slightly movable, it's amphiarthrotic. And if it's immovable, it's synarthrotic. And you're going to see that we actually have some nuances within this as we're going along. Let's take a look at a fibrous joint, okay? And you can see here inside the skull where you actually have these sutures that are put together from now mature plates of intramembranous bone growth. Did you get that? And what's happened is you've created these sutures, and look, here's compact bone out here, compact bone out there, and you now have this spongy bone inside there, and to hold it all together, you create a suture. You're going to put a fiber around that, okay? A fibrous joint permits little or no movement. Now, over time, if I put what's called a halo on this and I wanted to change the shape of your skull, I could do that. You do it with your teeth all the time. There are 3 different types of fibrous joints: sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses. Okay? These occur the bones between your skull. It's not only inside the bones of your skull. You actually have a suture that occurs inside the acetabulum, which is the fusion of your pelvic bones. Syndesmoses permit slight movement, okay, if you think about between the tibia and the fibula. Okay, there's literally a membrane inside there, and if you eat like a chicken wing, you'll see that membrane inside there. Gomphoses, these are called immovable joints, but in reality, if you get hit hard enough, that joint is definitely movable. Okay. Cartilaginous joints. These do not have a synovial joint, and they allow little to no movement. And the example I'm going to give you, of course, is that when we were building bone, you actually had epiphyseal growth plates. So here's one at the epiphysis of in this case, the femur, and we are going to call this a synchondrosis type joint. Don't remember synchondrosis. If you see that a couple of times in your lifetime, let me take that back. You should probably, if you have the bandwidth, to remember that cartilaginous joints come in two flavors: synchondroses, such as epiphyseal plates, or symphysis, like the pubic symphysis here. Then that might be worth your while. Generally speaking, though, if you remember there are cartilaginous joints, you're doing really good. Okay. So this is what I just told you a moment ago. Okay, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. What I want you to see, though, is the symphysis here. These are fibrocartilaginous structures. Okay, so if the ends of bones are hyaline cartilage, the disc is fibrocartilage. In between the pubic symphysis is also fibrocartilage. Okay. Synovial joints, these are freely movable joints. They have that articular capsule and they have a synovial fluid inside of it. We're going to go through the cartoon in a moment, but what they do is they reduce friction. That's their responsibility. The synovial fluid is actually going to be secreted by a population of cells we call synovial sites, and it's going to be surrounded by a capsule. And you can see that here. This is a joint of your finger, I believe. You have frontal plane of your finger. You have the outer capsular joint, which is dense irregular connective tissue, I believe. Then in red here, you have the synovial membrane in red. And you actually have the articular hyaline cartilage here, and now you've made some fluid. And once upon a time, that resistance was almost approaching zero, but now we're all old in that space. There's stuff that's been bound and ground into nothing, and everything feels weird when you're moving it. And what I mean by that is, as we age, the resistance, the articulation here is less fluid. Okay? So Mother Nature is going to support these structures by creating ligaments. And you'll see when we actually get to the knee itself, how she uses anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments to support angular movement of what should be pretty much linear force. And to protect the ends of bone, she's going to create these things that are called menisci. Okay? And they're going to now allow for a more tight articulation between, say, the distal head of the femur and the proximal head of the tibia. Now, all of this inside these synovial joints, there has to be some form of nerve supply, but not actually, how do I say this? Your body knows when there's swelling inside of your joint. Think about the last time you twisted your ankle and you could only move your foot so much and then you could feel pain, right? So there's nerve and blood supply there, but there's the nerve endings respond to a degree of movement and stretch at a joint. And you know this because these are Ruffini corpuscles. Arterial branches from several different arteries are going to merge and now actually surround, a joint before penetrating the actually articular capsule itself. So you actually have blood flow to the actual capsule, but the synovial fluid is not plasma of blood. In some instances, you're going to have bursa that are going to surround these synovial joints. Okay, so I'm thinking more along the lines of your shoulders and stuff like that when we're thinking about how they move when they come in contact between bones, so to cushion the blow, if you will. But if you think about your fingers and around your wrists, you're going to put tendinal sheaths around those, and that actually reduces friction at the joint. So if you take a look at your wrist, and you see some tendons just underneath the surface there, those actually have a tendinal sheath around them. So why do we care? Well, if joints, and in this case freely moving joints, make up our body, because those freely moving joints are synovial joints, we can actually start describing the type of movement at those joints. And this is the stuff that people forget that's actually really, really important to remember. Movement at joints can be grouped into four main categories: gliding, angular, rotational, and we'll worry about special movements later. But gliding movements, simple movement back and forth. If you think about in between your intercarpal bones, or no real angle change, but it has a limited range of motion. Okay, think waving your hand, as you're saying bye-bye to somebody. Angular movements, this is when things get a little bit more intense, right? Where you increase or decrease the angle between two articulating bones. When you're flexing, think about every time this semester I've had you pull your hand towards your face to flex your biceps muscle. angular movement. Extension, now you're going to move that hand away from your face. You're moving away from the body, we're moving it laterally, okay? Abduction is to move it away from the body. Adduction is to, it doesn't necessarily have to be the body, to away from where the location is starting, and adduction is towards you, where you're starting. And circumduction is to create a circle. So you actually add multiples of these together. And you can go through these definitions. It's not that I don't want to go through them with you, but this is the sort of stuff where you make a flashcard, and this might be helpful. Or you draw a skeleton of a set of bones, and you say to yourself, okay, if I was to do abduction here, maybe you just copy the cartoons inside the textbook, or the photomicrographs I just showed you for each of these. Okay, but flexion, of course, is going to decrease the angle between articulating bones. Extension is increasing the angle. Lateral flexion is sideways away from the trunk, at the right or the left. Hyperextension, of course, is to get it moved beyond its normal extension. Abduction, like I said, is movement of a bone away from the midline. Adduction is a movement of bone toward the midline, whatever the midline is for that bone. I think that's the tricky part for that one. Okay, so if we have all these synovial joints, and these are the types of movements, what do you actually see? Okay, well, you see special movements. These are the elevations, depressions, protractions, retractions, inversions, eversions. I can go on and on and on and on. Okay, here's a pretty, interesting list. And opposition, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the more important ones. It's where your finger and your thumb are opposable, and that's what makes us so interesting. Or if you're pulling your foot off of the gas pedal, okay, pulling your foot off of the gas pedal as you just see the police car, or you need to get home quickly after class because you've just about had it and you want a strong drink of something. Okay, these are the sorts of things that seem like they're really simple and you're going to forget about them, but the number of students who have forgotten what dorsiflexion is versus, say, inversion versus eversion, it's difficult to say that this is important, but it's not the most important things you need to learn. Okay. At a synovial joint itself, you can classify it based on the type of movement. Meaning, do you have a planar joint? Do you have a hinge joint, a pivot joint, condylar joint, a saddle joint, or ball and socket joint? And if I'm you, I'm learning just their descriptions, right? So here's a planar joint right here. These are between the cuneiform bones inside your foot. Or here's a hinge joint between the humerus and the ulna, right? So you literally think about how you dance as a hinge. Okay, you could also have a hinge joint at the knee and at the knee as well. We think about a pivot joint. These take this annular ligament here. It's actually causing a pivot point, and joints that enable the palm to turn anteriorly and posteriorly. Condylar joints are the sum of bones, where you actually have an oval shape interface, a condyloid structure. And that fits into now the sum of these would be the condyloid structure, and the fossa would be the radius bone here. Okay. Finally, saddle joints. Saddle joints create a saddle-like shape. So if here are the bones, you would actually have move in space. So here would be the radius and the ulna, and here would be the trapezium all the way through. You can see how they move around. And then ball and socket joints. These are the easiest ones, right? Your shoulder and your hip are the best examples of those. And there's this nice table 9.2 inside your textbook for those of you who are using this book inside Anatomy and Physiology. This is from Tortora and Derrickson, I believe. And you can see that you actually have every single one of the types of joints I've broken down for you here. And you can actually have its functional classification and examples. Nudge, nudge, hint, hint, wink, wink. Okay, for each of these. If I'm you guys and I've just spent probably 10 of the last 14 minutes talking about synovial joints, I'm spending a fair amount of time thinking about what these are doing. At the end of the day, all of these joints regulate what we call range of motion, which refers to the measure in degrees of a circle through which a bone of a joint can be moved. The factors that are obviously going to restrict that are going to be the shape of the articulating bones, as well as the strength and the tension on ligaments. If you go to the gym all the time and all you do is build muscle, okay, and you do not increase your range of motion by stretching, you will decrease the range of motion, okay? Does that make sense? Now, what I want to introduce to you in this last couple of minutes here is factors that affect the contact can be the arrangement of the tension of those muscles, the contact of soft parts, and the different hormones. Relaxin is going to be a hormone we spend a fair amount of time talking about inside AMP2 at the beginning part of the semester. It is designed to be periodically released into the circulatory system of females so that you relax the pubic symphysis as well as the ligaments. Now, the downside to this, of course, is if you've relaxed these bone structures, your muscles have to work more diligently to hold everything together, and that's why you actually end up with exhaustion in those muscles and you end up with back pain. Okay? That makes sense? I certainly hope it does. Okay, so we're going to take a look at primarily the knee joint, but you're going to see I'm going to walk us through here in the last couple of slides. So selected joints inside the body are the temporomandibular joint, temporal bone, and mandible. Shoulder joint, remember it's the clavicle, the scapula, and the humerus. Your elbow joint, it's your radius and your ulna. Your hip joint, your ulna and your humerus. Sorry about that. Your hip joint, which is your trickier one. This is 3 bones of your hip, okay? Ilium, ischium, and pubis, which have fused at the acetabulum to interact with the head of the femur. And then the knee joint, which is where we're going to start. In the knee joint, historically speaking, we've had students draw for years in this class because here's the femur and here's the tibia, and now what you can do is, depending on which way you cut it, you can see that you actually have specific layers of ligaments and tendons that are holding this in place. So because here's the femur and this is a muscle, this is the tendon of the quadriceps femoris, right? But below it, you actually have the patellar ligament. Tendon, muscle to bone, ligament, bone to bone. This is the fibula over here, so therefore I know my lateral patellar reticulum as well as my lateral and fibular collateral ligament are here. And you can see medial patellar reticulum is here as well as the tibial collateral ligament are in place. You then have the articular capsule, which means deep to that you're actually going to have the synovial joint, and that's exactly what you see because here are your menisci. That means you have fluid inside of this space to reduce the friction. Okay. A little bit more of a relief. Okay, you've taken away some of the complexity. Here's the actual articulation of the patellar surface of the femur itself, right? Because here's the patella where it's going to interact. You can actually see the anterior cruciate ligament and the posterior cruciate ligament behind that. And here's the meniscus, lateral meniscus, and medial meniscus, and here's our tibia there. And what they've done, of course, is here's a bird's eye view or a superior view, and you can see how the meniscus is holding the articulation points in place. Okay? We have you learn medial and lateral collateral ligament, as well as anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments, along with the patella, the tendon, and the patellar ligament. Okay, so make sure when you're thinking about this, you're not spending too much time going, oh my God, this is so complex. Here's that temporomandibular joint I mentioned a moment ago. Here's the mandible, here's the temporal bone, and lo and behold, there it is inside that space. Your shoulder joint, here is the space. Here's the best production of it, right? Here is the clavicle. You can actually see the glenoid cavity that's being made here, and here's the head of the femur that's sitting inside that space. Here's that elbow. Here's the humerus. Here's the ulna, and you can actually see how it's pulled into shape. Notice you can't actually see the joint here, so don't worry about that. And here's a bursa down here. Every once in a while, when you actually smack that bone well enough, you hit the funny bone. Well, literally what you're doing, of course, is you're smacking that bursa strongly enough to actually cause that to happen. Here is the acetabulum, and the acetabulum is the formation of fused bones of the ilium, ischium, and pubis. And what happens is the femur inserts the actual head of the femur into this space. Okay, so literally it's almost locked into place. You don't want this popping out if you can help it, right? Accidentally or otherwise. Okay, so the last one would be what would happen, how do we actually have hip replacements? And if you've ever seen these things, they're actually kind of, I would say, borderline comical as to it. It looks like you're repairing furniture when you're seeing it happen. But Remember, this has been 20 minutes of introducing to you the fact that Mother Nature uses either movable, slightly movable, or immovable joints. And notice we spent most of our time talking about movable joints, and those movable joints are synovial joints, and they have a specific construction, and they have specific types of movement that can happen at them. Okay. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.